When people find out I'm a deacon, one of the first questions that I'm often asked is, Chris, what prompted you to look at the diaconate? And well, it was a weekend very similar to this weekend. And while I had often felt the call and the tug of my heart to look at the diaconate, I had been putting it off for quite some time. But on this particular weekend, I was helping put on a retreat at my church. And as we sat down for dinner that night on Saturday night, a gentleman sat across the table from me and he looked at me directly in the eyes and said, Chris, now tell me, when are you going to become a deacon? To be honest, I was flabbergasted because I had never told anyone other than my wife that I had thought about being a deacon. And so I began to realize that that was God tapping me on the shoulders, finally saying, Chris, you know those gifts that I've given you, those gifts that I've given you to build up yourself into the person you are today, those gifts, I need you to go out and share those with my world. Go share those with my children. And so within the week, I went and visited with one of the deacons at my church, only to find out that they were starting the next class within a couple of months. And so 6 years later, I was ordained a deacon for the Catholic Diocese of Dallas. Now in our readings today, we see a bunch of readings that are very, very rich on how they describe God, rich on how they describe our relationship with Him, and what God wishes for us to do. Now in our gospel reading today, we get to hear about the wedding at Cana. And in it, there's a story about transformation. Jesus begins his public ministry there at the wedding by helping out a bride and groom who committed a faux pas, running out of wine during the wedding. Jesus tells the stewards to fill up 6 stone jars. Now these jars weren't little mason jars that we use for canning. They weren't gallon jars. They weren't even a 5-gallon bucket. These stone jars held 20 to 30 gallons each. So that's a lot of water. And so the waiters did as he instructed. He goes, take a sample, bring it to the head waiter. Well, they took this sample of water to the head waiter, and I can only imagine what they were thinking as they did this. They knew where this water was coming from, and so when they gave it to the head waiter, I was wondering if the waiter was going to be angry at him for giving them something, or if they were just thinking, this is going to be a funny joke. But anyway, they did as Jesus instructed, and when they came and they gave the waiter the water and he tasted it, I could only imagine what their looks were then when he went over to the bridegroom and said, this is the best wine that you serve now. I can only imagine that their jaws dropped and hit the ground because they knew where that water came from. See, these weren't naturally fresh spring water that you would drink. This was the water that the Jews used for the ritual cleansing when they would wash their hands before they ate. And so Jesus took something that was plain and ordinary and turned it into something spectacular and extraordinary. Now, Jesus does the same thing with us. In our second reading today, we hear St. Paul talking about the gifts that God gives us. Some of these gifts are spiritual gifts, such as faith, charity, wisdom. Other gifts are physical gifts, such as strength, intellect, talents for the arts, such as writing, sculptures, or even singing. Now, he gives us all these different gifts, and each person receives gifts. We don't all receive the same ones. We receive different gifts at varying levels. We're never the exact same as somebody else. But God gives us the gifts that we need, the gifts that He knows will turn us into the person He wants us to be, that He needs us to be, and He wishes us to be. Sometimes, though, just as Mary had to do with Jesus, we have to be prompted to use those gifts when God needs us to. Sometimes, for me, I put it off for 15 years before I gave God my yes. Because sometimes we feel like we're inadequate. We feel that we don't have the right gifts. Maybe we feel that we're not ready, that we're trying to use the gifts that God has given us, but we really don't want to do it because we're unsure that we'll be able to accomplish what God wants us to do. And sometimes we just don't see it, that we have those gifts and that we're ready, and we just put on blinders. But God knows. He understands that hesitation. But God will never ask us to do something that we're not ready for. He'll never ask us to do something that He hasn't already given us the gifts to accomplish. And so we have to put our trust into God and say yes when that time comes, when that opportunity arises. Now, sometimes we're prompted because God puts us in a certain situation, and when it happens, we can't do anything but respond in a godly way and use those gifts as He wants us to. Sometimes God will send a person to us, and that person will help prompt us in using those gifts because of their situation. And sometimes we're lucky enough where those gifts that God gives us becomes our livelihood, such as singing, teaching, being a doctor, being a farmer. There's lots of things, lots of gifts that God gives us that we turn into our livelihood. And so as we go through our days and we start to use these gifts, we have to be able to say yes to God and use them in the way He asks us to use them. Now, sometimes God wants us to be Mary for others. He wants us to be the prompt that gets the others to use their gifts. And so as we sit here today, just let me ask you a couple of questions. Have you ever thought about going on a retreat? Have you ever thought about being a witness on one of the retreats? Those are things that get people to give up their inability to say yes. Have you ever thought about mentoring somebody, being a mentor to help prompt them along? Have you ever thought about being a teacher for our faith formation classes here at St. Mary's? Being a teacher for the youth or even the adults in faith formation? Have you ever thought about joining one of the many ministries here at St. Mary's? Or even better yet, have you ever thought about starting a new ministry to fulfill a need that we might be missing here? There's a lot of ways that we can use our gifts to prompt others to use their gifts. And we have to be open to be able to do that. Think about that, pray about that, and really work at that to fulfill God's desire for us, to become the greatest person that we can become, which is what God wants us to do. And so as we go and we use our gifts, the funny thing is God gives those to us. He's never gonna force us to use those gifts. That is our free will. That is His gift to us. He'll give us the gifts of spiritual and physical gifts, but He'll never make us use them unless we want to. And so it's up to us to actually say yes to God, to go forward and to start our work for Him here on earth. And so as you go through your days today and as you go through your life, be conscious of the gifts that God has given you. Be conscious of the tuggings on your heart, where He's pulling you, what He's asking you to do. And sometimes it is that point where we have to look and say, is it time yet to use these gifts, or is it still in the future? For me, luckily, He never quit pulling on my strings and finally pulled me into the diaconate. And as you continue to use those gifts, and as you continue to build up His kingdom here on earth, God will return blessings upon you abundantly and wonderfully. And especially He'll give you the gifts of hope, faith, and love, along with His mercy and grace. And so I ask y'all to think about it, pray about it, and to use your gifts to help build up His kingdom here on earth as it is in heaven.